Oh, never say the M word in front of Bruce.
So, I saw a meme recently that poked fun at comic books. It's pretty funny because it's true. It says, I want to read this series. Where do I start? Comics. You start with Batman #1 from 2011. Not to be confused with Batman #1 from 1940, Batman #1 from 2016, or Batman Year 1. Manga. Chapter 1, bro. It's a funny meme, but it has a point. In the comic book world, there are countless reboot series with different timelines and continuities. Some runs are connected to other series, while others aren't. Some of the standalone elsewhere stories that don't take anything else into consideration. So for a newcomer, it can be difficult trying to figure out where to start. So that got me thinking. If you were to take someone that has no knowledge of a character like, let's say, Batman, what would you recommend to help them get acquainted with the character? First, we're gonna have to pretend that a person like this actually exists, because Batman is literally one of the most recognizable superheroes ever, right alongside Spider-Man and Superman. Seriously, he's been in the public zeitgeist since when? The 80s? He has several movies, animated shows, and merchandise out the ass. So most people have like a passing knowledge of the character. A kid's parents gets killed by a mugger. The kid grows up to fight crime. But for the sake of this scenario, and for this video, we're gonna pretend that there is someone out there like this. I mean, of course, odds are there probably are a few people out there who have no idea who Batman is. I'm just saying it's probably not that likely, especially if they have a connection to the internet, go to the movies, or watch TV shows. They basically have to be cut off from the outside world and media in general to not have at least heard of this character. But like I said, let's pretend. So I made a post asking people to recommend 2 comics, 2 animated movies, and 2 live action movies to someone who has no knowledge of the character. And yes, I purposely worded it like this to leave out the option to say Batman the Animated Series, because that would have been just too easy. Hey yo, but a shout out to Brave and the Bold and Batman Beyond. So I scrolled through the replies and compiled what you guys recommended for first time viewers. I'm gonna mention the ones that I saw pop up the most first, and I'll talk about a few others I saw here and there. So, let's get started.
This is where I watched my parents die, Raphael. Oh,
Now as for the comics, 2 kept popping up time and time again, and it's no surprise really. It was Batman Year 1 and The Long Halloween. Year 1 because, well, it's basically the definitive origin story. You get the tragic event that changes Bruce's life, his early days of fighting crime, learn how corrupt Gotham is. It introduces everything pretty well, which is why so many recommended it. It's pretty much essential reading. Now as for The Long Halloween, this is another popular choice because you not only have a more experienced Batman, but you get a nice cool detective story, some action, a great villain origin story, but more importantly, as I saw someone else point out, you get this shift from organized crime to more supervillains. So yeah, both of these are great options and they're really popular, so it's not surprising that they were mentioned. But I want to talk about a few more that I saw people mention. First was Batman Year 0. That's also not a bad choice. It's basically the new 52 origin story for Batman, and it's just very similar to Batman Year 1 because it is an origin story that follows the beginnings of Batman, but he has a new look and Riddler is the main antagonist. Speaking of New 52, we got the Court of Owls, which was one of the new storylines created after the Flashpoint, so it doesn't require much knowledge on the character to get into, and it kind of starts to establish its own mythology and stuff like that. Plus, it's cool to dive into the inner workings of Gotham dating back to the city's creation. Also, Batman Ego popped up, which is a good look and dive into the psyche and mental state of Batman, and the toll that the job puts on him. So the story itself is a one-shot graphic novel, but it's usually bundled in this collection of stories that focus on Batman, and it's paired with a Catwoman story, called Selina's Big Score. So if you were to buy this, usually it's bundled with other stories. Also, here's a fun fact, it was also a source of inspiration for Matt Reeves' The Batman. So hey, that's pretty cool. Okay, the last one I'll mention is Batman Hush, which really is a great one, and you get to see a wide look at the Rogues Gallery. You also got a cool mystery about who's pulling the strings and doing this to Bruce. On top of that, Hush is just pretty awesome here. Now, on the flip side, there are a few others I saw pop up that I personally wouldn't recommend to a newcomer, and I figure we might as well talk about those too. The first was The Dark Knight Returns. Now, I love this story too, it's great, but I believe a story like this is meant for people who are familiar with Batman already. It shows him at a different point of his life and career, and also his deteriorating mental state. It's a story made for people who already know Batman, so that's why I wouldn't recommend it to someone who knows nothing about him. Another one is The Killing Joke. This story is also awesome, I like it a lot too. Hell, I love the Joker. But that's the thing, this story is more about the Joker rather than Batman, which I guess wouldn't be a bad first read for newcomers, since it does dive into his most famous villain. But I think it's best to have Batman be the main focus in our recommendations, which is also why I'm not mentioning many others that involve other heroes, like the Batman Superman series, or the Injustice comics. I just want to keep it focused on the Batman himself. Now I know some people might roll their eyes at some of these picks because they are the most popular and most talked about stories, but that's for a reason. A lot of these stories are basically the blueprint for Batman, and serve as a jumping off point, especially with the topic of trying to introduce this character to someone brand new. You can't go wrong with the classics that make up the foundation. I mean, I like stories like The Batman Who Laughs, Three Jokers, and Death of the Family, but I wouldn't recommend them to newcomers. We want to give them like a baseline. Although once they're much more familiar with the character, they definitely could get into stuff like that, as well as Dark Victory, White Knight, and of course The Killing Joke, The Dark Knight Returns, and Nightfall. Now that'll do it for the comics portion of the video, which is easily the longest part because there's just so many different options to choose from. So now let's move on to animated movies.
My name's Richard Grayson, but all the kids at the orphanage call me Dick.
Well, children can be cruel.
Yeah.
This section was basically unanimous. Almost everyone said the same two movies, Under the Red Hood and Mask of the Phantasm. Under the Red Hood is my personal favorite, and Mask of the Phantasm is also great. I mean, there's countless videos out there that explaining why. That really just dive into it. Now, this may be a sin, but I actually preferred Under the Red Hood movie more than the Death in the Family story that it's based off of. That's because it's much more focused and concise than the comic. I also saw several people recommend the animated versions of Year One and The Long Halloween. Yeah, I guess you could do that, although I think the comic book versions are better. The animated section can be tricky because there are several stories involving Batman that are either like Justice League focused or involve more members of the Bat family, or some are just standalone elsewhere stories like Batman Ninja or Gotham by Gaslight, which are some pretty fun movies. So yeah, you kind of want to give them a movie that doesn't require much knowledge about other characters and heroes of the world, and it's easy to jump into. So several of the DC animated universe movies are kind of out, because of how they show different heroes and villains and characters that would require seeing a different movie in the DC animated universe. But say after seeing stuff like Year One, The Long Halloween, Under the Red Hood, or Mask of the Phantasm, they could quickly venture off into other animated movies that feature a wider range of heroes and more abstract ideas and concepts, like Batman Ninja or Gotham by Gaslight. Oh yeah, and a shout out to Batman vs. Dracula, that shit was badass. And that'll do it for the animated movie section. Honestly, it was pretty unanimous amongst everybody which ones people should see. And now it's time to move on to the live action movies.
You let 5 people say the N-word.
Now, the two I saw the most are The Dark Knight and The Batman. Now, with The Dark Knight, I think the movie works pretty well on its own, so you don't really have to watch Batman Begins to get the gist of it. But if I'm recommending it to a newcomer, I would tell them watch Batman Begins, then The Dark Knight. Now, as for The Batman, it does skip over his origin, and I think it's similar to Spider-Man Homecoming, where it kind of assumes you know the origin, so it doesn't really bother diving that much into it, or setting that up. Instead, it takes place not long after the origin stuff happens, and it just goes from there and assumes that you kind of know what it is. Now, The Dark Knight and The Batman are very similar in the sense that they are more grounded looks of Batman with less fantastical elements. Like, there's no crazy oversized villains, there's no magic. The Batman isn't as realistic as The Dark Knight, but it still does try to feel as grounded as possible without being hyper realistic. And that's the reason why I would recommend Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie. It's not nearly as realistic or grounded as Nolan's movies or Matt Reeves' The Batman, so it offers a different look at the character and basically says, yeah, things can be pretty over the top and crazy. I saw some people recommend Batman Returns, and that's basically a 1989 Batman with all its weird elements cranked up to 11, with Tim Burton just being Tim Burton. So yeah, I did cheat a little bit because I did say to only name 2, but I feel like if you're going to watch The Dark Knight, it helps if you watch Batman Begins, because they go together really well. But then on the flip side, I also think you should watch The Batman and the 1989 Batman movie as well, just to give you a wider range of different takes on the character. And plus, these are the 4 that I saw pop up the most. Joel Schumacher's movies are really campy, and really aren't for everyone, and really could be a turnoff to newcomers. And I wouldn't recommend Zack Snyder's Justice League because that is a Justice League team-up movie. And even though I think Batman vs. Superman offers a very interesting look at the character, especially in live action, it definitely does require that you watch Man of Steel beforehand to really get the full understanding of events, characters, and the world. And very similar to The Dark Knight Returns, this is a Bruce Wayne and Batman at a different point in his life and career, so you do kind of have to be more familiar with Batman to fully get this version of him, or at least I think it helps.
There you see, Batman doesn't kill people.
Because he's a pussy!
But yeah, I think it's going to do it for the video. I thought it was very interesting to see what people had to say and what they would recommend to newcomers to Batman. And yeah, we saw a lot of the same things, but that's because you try to recommend something that's very accessible, that doesn't require much prior knowledge. So when introducing the character to a newbie, it kind of limits your options. But I think it's going to do it. So if you enjoyed the video, go and drop a like on it. And leave a comment, let me know, what would you recommend to a newcomer to help them get introduced to the Batman? What comics, what animated movies, and what live action movies? And as a bonus, what would be a comic or animated movie that you would recommend to somebody who is more familiar with the character, but wants to try out new things? Leave a comment, let me know. Thanks for watching.
Why don't you just admit that you find me irresistible? Irresistible? Come on!
Miss, I must warn you of a great uprising in the southern regions.